Rank-and-file Republicans are fuming after news emerged that President Trump had dinner with Democrats and made an apparent breakthrough on DACA, the program allowing young undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States. Some conservatives felt they'd been stabbed in the back for the second time in 2 weeks after the president made a deal with Democratic leaders over the debt ceiling. And as you can see, sites like Breitbart reacted accordingly. Amnesty Don. Now the president says he's working on a plan for the so-called Dreamers, that nothing has been agreed to yet. And get this, he says Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan are on board. Joining me now, Ron Brownstein. He's a CNN senior political analyst. Matt Visor, he's a CNN political analyst and deputy Washington bureau chief at the Boston Globe. We also have Rebecca Berg with us. She's a CNN political analyst and a national political reporter at Real Clear Politics. Ron, let's start with you. Republicans have been fighting for this moment for more than 8 years. They control both houses of Congress. They control the White House. But it seems like power and influence is drifting away from the establishment wing of Republican Party politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the first deal was cut, there were a lot of people who thought on the budget and extending the debt ceiling through December. There were a lot of people who thought the president was just kind of sending a personal message to Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan that he was frustrated with them, he doesn't have good chemistry with them. But clearly, in the DACA conversation about the young undocumented immigrants, more is at work here. And I think there is reason for Republicans to be concerned, and there's also reasons to understand why this can only go so far. The reason for Republicans to be concerned is I think the White House has clearly recognized that trying to govern solely on a party line basis at a moment when the Congress is this and the country is this closely divided leaves them with very little margin for error and gives too much influence to every faction in the Republican Party. That's what they saw during health care. On the other hand, Boris, I think there is a limit here in that the vast majority of things that the president wants to do are not things that are going to have very much, if any, Democratic buy-in. For example, on the young undocumented immigrants is probably the least defensible grounds for the restrictionists to fight on. It's the thing that has the most support in the public, providing them some kind of legal status. So he can make a deal there. When you turn to the next steps of his agenda, from the wall to cutting legal immigration, a lot fewer Democrats are going to be interested in trying to find a deal there.
Yeah, Rebecca, let's move forward on that. How does this potentially help the president, who seems very anxious to wave any accomplishment in the air, regardless of who's helping him accomplish it, whether Republicans or Democrats? How does this help him with, say, tax reform?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, he wants to build momentum. He wants to show that he is open to negotiating, that he is open and flexible, and that he wants to get things done as opposed to some sort of ideological intransigence. He wants to negotiate. And so that's going to set the tone, I think, for tax reform. Now, the fact remains that there is a very busy legislative schedule ahead. They pushed the debt limit and spending to the end of the year, in addition to this immigration discussion now on top of that. And so that's all piled up in addition to what they want to do on tax reforms. They're having to balance all of these demands at once. But certainly Republicans want to get tax reform done. The president wants to get tax reform done. What this is doing is sending the message that on some of the hot button issues, like, for example, corporate tax reform, maybe Republicans, or at least the president, is going to be a little more flexible than maybe Democrats originally anticipated.
Matt, to you, I'm curious to how you see this playing out in 2018, especially if the president, now working with Democrats, was quick to signal that there might be some opposition to Republicans that were on, let's say, competitive ground. Dean Heller in Nevada comes to mind, Jeff Flake in Arizona, places where they could potentially see Republicans running from the right. Does this help them that the president is now working with Democrats?
It helps somebody like Jeff Flake and Dean Heller, for that matter. I mean, people who have been more pragmatic within the Republican Party. And I think that's where you have a little bit of angst within the party, is that the president and his latest maneuvers could give cover, to not only those Republicans, but moderate Democrats. Heidi Heitkamp, he was with her recently and had sort of nice things to say about her. So the amount of raw partisanship potentially goes away a little bit among some more moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats, which could very well play into the midterm elections.
Ron, back to you. I'm not sure if we have it, but we had it earlier. I want to show you this image coming from Breitbart. Apparently, they're reporting that some Trump supporters are burning their Make America Great Again hats over this apparent agreement to later have an agreement on DACA between the president and Democrats. How does this play with his base? Do you anticipate this being the broader response among Trump voters?
I don't on these grounds, Boris. I think that, as I said, I think that for the restrictionists, the question of how to deal with the young undocumented immigrants brought here by their parents has always been the most difficult ground to defend. I mean, you have over 3/5 of the country consistently saying they should have legal status. I saw polling this week where you had 40% of non-college whites, 50% of people over 60, groups at the cornerstone of the Republican coalition saying that they should have legal status. So I don't think that this is the breaking point. I mean, the question is, as you go forward, how far can he push it? Where Trump has lost ground, interestingly, people talk about the base being solid. That is true in the sense of the kind of the cornerstone of the people who voted for him in the primary and the general election. But if you look at the polling, he has lost support of a lot of the people who voted for him in a kind of ambivalent way in the general election, particularly college-educated white voters who had doubts about his qualifications but didn't want Hillary Clinton. That's where he suffered the most erosion. And it may be that as you go forward, he could restore some support in a deal-making mode among those voters, even if he loses some on the other end among people who feel that he has been kind of ideologically too squishy.
And Rebecca, getting back to the establishment wing of the Republican Party, the president is saying that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are on board with this apparent DACA solution that he came up with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. How real is that? Are they encouraged by this, or are they perhaps taken aback by the president embracing Chuck Schumer the way he did in that picture?
I mean, certainly it's a shock to Republicans that the president is more eager, it seems, at least for the moment, to negotiate with Democratic leaders than with his own party, and to let them sort of take the lead on this. But by the same token, I think Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell would be happy with a deal if there is some measure of increased border security. And that's something that the president and the Democratic leaders have discussed and have raised publicly this past week. That is the sort of thing that they would want to be able to give cover to their more conservative members in the Republican conference in the Senate and the House, so that they can go back to their districts and then say, well, there was this deal with the Dreamers, this deal on DACA, but at the same time we are increasing border security and still focused on that issue. And that's something that will resonate with the base. So I think that's what they're going to be looking for here. But certainly, I mean, the president is removing what is a very sticky issue for Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell to have to deal with. As Ron was saying, this is something that even among Republicans, you see a lot of sympathy for these Dreamers. And so this is one less issue of controversy that Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan have to address because the president is taking the lead on it.
Matt, at the risk of getting yelled at by my producers because we're just about out of time, I did want to sneak in one last question. We've heard two different versions about how the president might attach a border wall to any DACA solution. Do you see the border wall being a key bargaining chip when it comes to coming up with some kind of legal status for these Dreamers?
I don't know that it'll be part of the Dreamer debate. I think that President Trump has already kind of signaled that he's willing to look at the DACA program along with some type of border security that doesn't necessarily include the wall, because I don't think Democrats will go along at all with something like that. Mm-hmm. But what you have seen here, I mean, think about the first 7 months and the healthcare debate and how sort of utterly disengaged President Trump seemed on that. There has been a shift, and that he is the one leading in this instance in terms of negotiating. And that's different than punting to Congress. So I think you'll see Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell get engaged a little bit later, but it is a lot different from the President Trump that we saw during the early part of the administration.
All right, we have to leave it there. Ron Brownstein, Matt Visor, Rebecca Berg, thank you so much for spending some time with us this weekend. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Paul.